very quickly. I first want to thank the audience here. We have some very close colleagues and friends, and I want to simply point out that we have the Secretary of Health, Dr. Sophia Chan, Professor. Now, just for those of you that haven't come to these roundtable discussions before, just to let you know how we do it, we will have, I will introduce Dr. Mackay, and then we will get started on some questions, but I try to reserve as much time as possible, half the time for the audience, and so regardless of where I am with my questions, I'll stop at some point and I will simply open it up to the audience. So from the beginning, if you can think about what you might want to ask Judith, I think that will also save us some time. Now, the genesis of this series, this Global Movers and Shakers series of talks that we've been doing now for the past few years, is really to learn from people who are shaping the world, particularly the world of health. And these are people who are shaping the world both through their ideas, by their words, and also by their actions. And so we've had a quite august group of people from around the world come and talk to us, but I think it's with particular pride when we can talk to somebody who's actually shaking the world here from Hong Kong. So it's somebody from home. Now, also normally I try to be fairly perfunctory about the introduction so we can have as much time for questions as possible, but this time I have to spend a few more minutes, and this is partly because I came upon an interview in the South China Morning Post, which was quite interesting and informative. So Professor Mackay, is originally from Yorkshire, England, and she came to Hong Kong when she was a young woman. But when she was doing her internship, if I got this right from the article, she was at City Hospital in Edinburgh when she saw a man on the tuberculosis ward. And she said, and I quote, "The second I saw John, I knew he was the man that I was going to marry." Now, John is a cautious Scot, so it took him a few weeks to get around to the same idea. So I'm not going to embarrass you by asking what you did in those few weeks and how you got to come around to this idea, but is that right, John? Now, Judith moved to Hong Kong in 1967, which, as many of you know, was a time of great unrest in Hong Kong and a time of great uncertainty. And so when she got here, she studied Cantonese, and then she began working as a civilian medical practitioner in Kai Tak Army Clinic. And at that time, she was paid 75% of what a man would have been paid for the same work. And as you mentioned, this was really a
government policy.
Yes, it was a government policy, and it was really transformational for you in terms of becoming a feminist. And I think that partly as a result of the, how did you call it? Not hubbub, but a word like that at the time, this really changed Hong Kong's policy. And first, doctors got equitable pay, and then that's transferred over to the rest of civil society, or civil service. Now, after that, you joined Hong Kong University, and you worked both in the pediatric unit and then later in the medical unit, and you also got up in research on growth and development in Chinese children. And then after that, you went to do clinical work at the United Christian Hospital in Kwun Tong for several years, for 8 years. And in the article, you described how the population then, at that time, was really a very poor population, and you said the hospital was serving about 750,000 people, of whom there were a great number of both social problems and health issues, and particularly tuberculosis is one of the issues that you pointed out. And then you pointed out that later on you started writing columns for the South China Morning Post for women, and you covered tobacco at that time. And you wrote a series of articles both describing the harm from tobacco, but also really advocating for banning the advertisement of cigarettes. And there was quite a strong reaction from the British American tobacco company, and at that time they said that there was no evidence that smoking, and certainly not secondhand smoking, caused harm in people. And I think that you mentioned that this really made you angry, and that this was really the start of when you began to take on tobacco. So consequently, Judith went on to become named as one of the 3 most dangerous people in the world by the tobacco industry. Which I'm guessing among the many, many awards is probably the one you're maybe most proud of.
Number 1.
Number 1, yes. Judith became the first executive director of the Hong Kong Council on Smoking and Health. And the efforts with her colleagues here have been, as you know, quite astounding. Hong Kong now has a smoking prevalence rate of about 10.5%, virtually the lowest in the world, and so a huge victory in that sense. She has been an honorary professor in the School of Public Health at Hong Kong University for many years, I think since the late 90s. She is an honorary fellow of the Hong Kong College of Cardiology and the Hong Kong College of Community Medicine. She has received awards from the King of Thailand, an Order of British Empire from Queen Elizabeth. She has been named by Time magazine as among the 100 most influential people in the world. She was the first recipient of the British Medical Journal's Lifetime Achievement Award. And she also has 2 sons and 3 grandkids. So if you can join me in welcoming Professor Judith Mackay. So Judith, this is my want. I prepared a couple of questions, and let me start with the first one. So the first one is that, you've had a highly visible career both as an advocate and as a champion. And it is both partly championing health and rights and fairness, but it's also different than being a regular doctor. I mean, it really has something which requires a kind of warrior mentality, because you are also going to take on opponents. And so, did this just happen, or why did you choose to do this?
Well, I think you've already mentioned some of the things that changed me from curative hospital medicine into preventive health. They were, first of all, working in the United Christian Hospital, and we had a maxim on our male medical ward in particular that we never admitted a non-smoker. This is back in the 80s. And they were all coming in with heart disease and with chronic bronchitis and with lung cancer, very often at a stage where cure was not possible. So I think that came to me in terms of realizing that health would never be improved in Hong Kong if we simply followed the ambulance or hospital route, and that somebody had to go a little bit higher up that river to try and stop them falling in the first place in classical public health terminology. And the second thing was indeed my interest as a feminist in women's health. And in those days, in Hong Kong and indeed around the world, women's health was defined very gynecologically. But I also realized that the tobacco industry were after women. They were particularly after Asian women. And we went through about a year in Hong Kong where every single dress shop I ever went into had free Virginia Slim cigarettes, lots of pictures all around the walls of the beautiful, slim, smoking Virginia Slims model. Actually not smoking. The models didn't smoke in the advertisements, but certainly looking very glamorous. And I came to realize that actually tobacco was a feminist issue, that it wasn't a freedom they were offering. They were holding out this idea that if you smoked, you're your own woman, you're advanced, you're independent. And it wasn't. It was a bondage. And women didn't need any more bondages. So I think I came to it through that feminist route. And then thirdly, as you said, writing in the SCMP. And I wrote 5. I wrote about mental health and contraception and the menopause. I wrote 5 on tobacco. And 2 were on the health side. Nothing happened. The 3rd was on banning advertising. And in those days in Hong Kong, advertisements were on every TV program, almost every single break, commercial break in TV programs. There was an advertisement for cigarettes. Even buildings 20 stories high would carry advertisement for cigarettes. It was just unbelievably tobacco land. And I wrote about banning advertising, and then the heavens descended on me from BAT, who said I was, actually published a pamphlet saying how irresponsible I was, how unaccountable, how unrepresentative, whereas they, the tobacco industry, were the best reliable source of information on tobacco. And it was just one of those defining moments of outrage, I mean, real outrage. So I think those three strands brought me to really working in tobacco control. And I left hospital medicine in 1984. And many people still to this day say to me, are you still working as a doctor? And I say yes. But I think the question you're asking me is, am I doing clinical medicine? And the answer to that is no. I still 100% feel I'm working as a doctor, but I'm working in prevention really rather than in cure. So I think those were the strands that brought me. And then in the very early days, I, for about, I would say less than 2 weeks, hoped that perhaps we could have some dialogue with the tobacco industry and work somehow with them. That really didn't even last a month. It was very clear that we were in two opposite camps. They had their shareholders, they were expanding their markets, particularly in Asia. You know, they said it themselves, that, you know, thinking about smoking statistics in Asia is like thinking about outer space. Or, I think it was Philip Morris said, no discussion of the year 2000 would be complete without the most important feature on the landscape, the China market. They saw if they could persuade Chinese men to smoke Marlboro, and if they could persuade Chinese women, Asian women, to start smoking, then it wouldn't matter if everybody in Britain stopped smoking tomorrow, just in terms of numbers. So this is why Hong Kong has become so important over the last many decades in tobacco control, because we are an exemplar, actually, along with Singapore, really to the rest of Asia. So we punch above our weight in terms of 7 million. And you asked me about fighting them. I think, interestingly enough, I had one of those gene profiles done, where you see where you came out of Africa. And I have got Viking blood in me, I've discovered. Viking blood from grandma. And so I think perhaps my fighting spirit comes from being on the east coast of England hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and having some of that Viking spirit in me.
Well, I'll try to avoid picking an argument with you. Now, well, building on that, you know, I think a big part of your life has been, you know, spent taking on smoking and big tobacco. And we're now in a period where the industry's focus is either expanding or perhaps shifting from traditional smoking products over to e-cigarettes and vaping. I mean, it's impossible to escape this. And so I think from someone who's been working on this for your entire lifetime, do these new products, does it require a different strategy? Can we think about these things as we did think about cigarettes, and then, or do we have to think about it differently? And then also, there are a number of main players who are needed. So what do you expect from the government? What do you expect from the other main players to do in terms of taking on this new direction, these new products?
I think I would first say how surprisingly similar tobacco control around the world is, just before we get to e-cigarettes. I work in countries where there are kings, there are communists, massive populations like China, tiny little islands like Kiribati. You could get the population in this room. Very different stages of development. And I have to say, it's the same. It's the same product, it's the same harm, it's the same obstacles, particularly in the tobacco industry, and it's the same thing that has to be done. The WHO's convention, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, is actually a testament to that. There's not one framework convention for poor countries or one framework convention for high-income countries. It's one for all of us. So I think, you know, the first principle of tobacco control is that if you do work in it, I've been working recently more in the Middle East as well, with countries there. Very different in many ways from Asia, but it's exactly the same problem. So when we come to e-cigarettes, I think that I would say many of the strategies for cigarettes can equally be transferred to e-cigarettes. It's the same, and particularly looking at the industry. One of the focuses of this talk is actually the industry. And interestingly enough, the tobacco industry has bought up most of the vape companies. It's buying them up as we speak. So it now is becoming the dominant player in the vape market. And I think we will never, ever get rid of either of these epidemics, whether it's cigarettes or the new products, unless we address the industry. The industry is a vector of this disease. I mean, we would never try and treat malaria without looking at the vector, which is the mosquito. We have got to look at what the industry is doing and the way it is interfering with and obstructing and trying to influence governments and to negate the things we know work. And in fact, in Australia, they even have identified what they call the scream test. If the industry screams, then you know it's worth doing. And what do they scream at in Hong Kong? They have screamed at tax increases, they screamed at the creation of smoke-free areas, they screamed at the advertising bans, they screamed at our changing our pack warnings from 50 to 85%. So in a sense, our research is done for us. We know these are the things that work. We know what to do. We know it from the industry itself. And what do they almost ignore? They almost ignore school health education. Everybody likes school health education. The teachers like it, the parents like it, the children like it. Does it bring down smoking rates? It does not. And also bans on sales to minors. Kids get round these by relatives and older friends and so on. So the tobacco industry, in a sense, tells us what we should be doing. So when we try and do these things, this is where the obstruction pops up. And it pops up with them trying to influence the government, the civil service government, trying to particularly nowadays, even more than ever, trying to influence LegCo. And I can certainly talk about LegCo, and there's a bunch of problems regarding LegCo and the whole tobacco epidemic. But it's a highly political issue, and these epidemics, not just tobacco, but if we're talking about NCDs, we're up against something very new, and that is the industry opposition by many industries. There's some really good industries as well. I'm happy to talk about those. But the industries that are trying to obstruct government policy. And tobacco is also interesting because we are a signatory to the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And in that, it very specifically states in Article 5.3 that the tobacco industry must not be included in the formation of government policy. The tobacco e-cigarette people here, to this day, as we speak, are complaining that they haven't got the ear of government. The government can't meet with them, they can't discuss it. They are bound by an international treaty not to involve the tobacco industry in formulating tobacco control policy. It's as simple as that.
So this is actually a nice segue into a question which actually is a little bit broader than the first two. So we are now in an era where many of our health concerns are focused on non-communicable diseases. And part and parcel of that is how do we get people to moderate the intake of things like sugar, alcohol, processed foods, and so on. And in taking this on, I think it's clear that a lot of the tactics and behaviors and practices of the tobacco industry are not unique. And they're really, and their attempts to safeguard products and profits, the behaviors are mimicked by a number of other industries and so on. And I think that it's also clear that moderating the intake of products, again, like sugar and alcohol, is different than trying to stop smoking. Probably more complicated. And so, given that sort of broader landscape which we've entered into, what do you see as the pillar for the long-term strategies for moderating commercial influences and for moderating the intake of things which in excess can harm people? You mentioned a little bit about education is nice, everybody likes it, but it really doesn't change things that much. So do you see the answers primarily in regulation and legislation? Do you see it in things such as taxing and pricing? Is it something else? How should we think about dealing with this sort of complicated group of issues?
I think you're right in saying that the tobacco industry is in a class of its own because there is no safe product. Even smoking 1 or 2 cigarettes a day is actually dangerous. And you're also right in saying that we used to think the tobacco industry was uniquely dreadful in the way that it behaved and obstructed government and the way it tried to use its influence, even in this department. In the 1980s, and TH will remember, I mean, it was actually working with 3 scientists within the Department of Public Health, trying to undermine the science. I mean, it was infiltrating organisations, it tried to infiltrate WHO, it tried to do many things, and we used to think that the tobacco industry was just uniquely dreadful. I think you're absolutely right that we realise now that many other industries, the fast food industry, the sugar industry, the alcohol industry, the gaming industry, many of them are employing almost identical tactics to the tobacco industry. And many of the times they're actually all working together, sometimes under the same umbrella, with some very powerful lobbyists. I mean, just to give you an idea, in the European Union, just on tobacco, there are 80 lobbyists at the headquarters of the EU in Brussels. 80 full-time lobbyists. And the public health community has about 5, if that, and they're temporary and they're part-time. It's a very David and Goliath situation. But these other industries are also now behaving, they're trying to obstruct policy. The food industry is doing this. The alcohol industry is certainly doing this. And yet these are also products that have a good side to them. Like if you just think of the food industry, there's a whole green food industry that is developing. There's a whole recycling food industry that is sort of developing. So it's not just as black and white as with tobacco. And in some ways, I think that makes it more difficult. But I think at minimum, what governments have got to do is to make sure that the policy that, after all, they are producing for the public good of Hong Kong, that they are not unduly interfered with by these various industries. And, I mean, I'll give you an example of one of the problems we have here with Legislative Council. There is no requirement in Hong Kong for the political parties, all of our political parties, to actually state where their funding is coming from. So we have no idea whether the tobacco industry, the alcohol industry, particularly if these issues are coming up in LegCo, we actually have no idea of that kind of financial influence behind the scenes. And LegCo has a lot of influence on health. It has to pass all this public health legislation. So I think there are some basic essentials that do need to be put in place. And I think transparency is certainly one of them. With tobacco, if the government meets with at all with the tobacco industry, there has to be transparency about what this is about. If I meet with the tobacco industry, because I'm a WHO senior policy advisor, I actually have to inform WHO that I've had a meeting and under what circumstances, and that's why I try and avoid meetings with the tobacco industry. So I think there are some essentials that really are across the board with all these industries. And you can look at several things. You can look at the products themselves, whether they're harmful or not and how harmful. You can look at the way the industry behaves in terms of marketing and promotion, and you can regulate some of that. And you can also look at their political lobbying and advocacy and really look at that. I think these are the 3 sort of areas where industry has a major effect upon health. The products themselves, the way that they behave, and for example in social marketing, and then finally really look at some of their obstruction and involving, for example, even things like our trade treaties. I don't know how many of you working in public health have ever really looked at some of these trade treaties that are being negotiated, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. There are clauses in there that would alarm you, and I'll tell you one of them. One of them with these trade treaties is that if a commercial organisation in country A feels that their product is being compromised by government action in country B, the commercial organisation, say the tobacco industry, can sue the government in that other country because it's interfering with their marketing, it's interfering with their sales. These are really dangerous public health clauses. I think we've got to look at these trade treaties much more carefully than we have done. So having said all of that, you'll realise immediately that all these new epidemics are absolutely in the field of the political, they're in the field of economics, they're not in the wards of hospitals, they're not in the waiting rooms of clinics. And yet it's the hospitals and the clinics that have all the funding. And somebody on the radio recently, I was discussing this, and they gave a very good example from the infectious disease world, and that was flu. You know, unless you put a megabyte of money into prevention now, like with the flu vaccine, you will have to spend a gigabyte later in terms of hospitals and the problems that you all know that we're having in Hong Kong. And this is absolutely true of public health as well. We are facing an absolute crisis of funding unless we really put much more efforts into prevention. Having said that, the Hong Kong government is one of the best, but still, it's entirely disproportionate what is going into these two fields. And particularly when we have industry opposing it at every turn and trying to undermine it, I think this really needs addressing at every level.
So Judith, let me extend this a little bit. You know, in addition to transparency, which is one of the things that you pointed out is really beneficial, I think that in working with industry, it's clear that it isn't all black. You know, there are many, many examples, and you know, particularly coming from WHO, where public health does partner with industry, and it really does things which neither side can do alone, which is to everyone's benefit.
Can I just say that when I first started thinking about this particular talk, I really thought about the sort of the good, the bad, the ugly. And coming from working with the tobacco industry, I started with the ugly. But then it was interesting. I sort of morphed somewhat into thinking, as you were saying, what are our allies? Who are our good industries? And they can range to bicycle manufacturers. They can range from people who are involved with healthy food. They can involve town planners. I mean, our walkways in Central are absolutely a brilliant example of preventive health, of getting people, you know, in a safe, dry, walkable place, rather than down on ground level. Country parks, I mean, people who even have pet food shops or sell animals, you know, animals keep people on their feet and walking around. When I sat down and really started thinking about what are our good industries, I just started realizing we actually rather underutilize those, I think, our natural allies. The sports industry, for example, is yet another example. I think, you know, there are many, many, many. And to the entertainment industry. However, what I came to feel, and that's talking about the entertainment industry, is that most industries come somewhere in the middle. And if you look at the entertainment industry, it can either make you laugh and be happy, or it can turn you into a sort of couch potato just sitting in front of TV every night. If you look at the pharmaceutical industry, that can save life, but it's got some pretty awful practices as well in terms of pricing and things like that and affordability of drugs. The food industry, we've got green food industries and cafes, more and more vegetarian, vegan places in Hong Kong, and yet at the same time we have very unhealthy food. So I think, you know, the bulk, probably a good 50% more is actually somewhere in the middle of the good and the bad. It occupies a middle place. But I did come to feel that I hadn't before really thinking about this talk. I certainly did come to feel that we have a lot of allies. And I was recently at the Mahidol conference in Thailand, and WHO was saying that even high street shops, originally everybody thought they would oppose pedestrianisation on a weekend. But actually what the shops found was they sold more. So they immediately became allies in what was to take the traffic off the street and let people walk around. So I think we just almost need a department in our mind where we are looking towards safely partnering with people who are basically our natural allies.
So basically, it's really what they do, not who they are. Really, because if we're occupying that middle ground, we can do things which are unhelpful, but we can do things which are very helpful.
I think we have to work it out, and different governments are doing it differently. The Singapore government, for example, have an absolute we will not partner with, and that is the tobacco industry and the arms industry. And they say all the other industry, it's on a, not exactly case-by-case approach, but they have to think it through. And this is a challenge to governments. We all have to eat. So to what extent, you know, do we partner, and to what extent we're quite cautious in terms of partnering with industry. And it's complex. In a sense, the tobacco industry is almost easier because it is very black and white with the tobacco industry. So as I said, I came to some kind of middle ground at the end of the day of just feeling that some of these partnerships are quite unexplored.
So everyone, I'm going to turn to you in a few minutes because you know, we're about halfway through, and so if you can think about whatever questions you may want to ask Professor Mackay. But Judith, let me ask you one more. The world of health is rapidly broadening, and it's evolving, and it's more complicated than ever, which gives both students and people who are early in their career more opportunities. but also I think it's more confusing to a lot of people. You've had a rather amazing career yourself, sort of going from clinical medicine to research to becoming an advocate. Any guidance, any things that you want to share with the audience here in terms of how do you sort of help think about the path forward?
Well, I think firstly there is definitely a career path for any young people working in public health for their entire lifetime. Because if you think back amongst most illnesses, whether it's the infectious ones like smallpox or malaria or TB, it's 100 years from the time of identification of a problem until even remotely approaching its solution. And the tobacco industry and all these other problems are going to be just as long. We've been really, in Hong Kong alone, we've been doing tobacco control since the late 70s. I mean, that's more than 50 years now that we've been working on tobacco control, and we're certainly not there yet. There's still more things that we really need to be doing. And also, the other thing with these industries is that you think you've got something in hand, you've done something, and that's it. But actually, you already need to be planning the next step, because it's never enough. When we first introduced warnings on the advertisements in Hong Kong, way back in the 80s, we had a 10% area. Well, that 10% was hidden beneath all the lights and buildings. It was grey on grey, so you couldn't see it. The font was so small you couldn't read. Immediately, we had to amend the legislation. It's got to be black and white, it's got to be in this font, the characters have got to be so high. Then we went from 10% to a bigger percent. Then, of course, we banned the advertisements. Now it's coming in through the movies, through product placement, through the social media. There is no end to it, no end to it at all. I mean, I would not have thought nearly 40 years ago when I first started working in tobacco control that somehow it would be as challenging 40 years later as it actually is. So I think there is a real career path ahead. But I think if you are going to work in non-communicable diseases, you have to, I'll say it again, understand this industry. In many of the countries where I go and work, I will often give a presentation. I'll say to my colleagues in the Middle East, for example, what is the tobacco industry doing in your country? And they have no idea at all. They've had legislation on the books for years that has just somehow not got through. And I say to them, why do you think this hasn't gone through? Why is this legislation just stuck and not really progressing? What is it that is actually preventing this happening? Do you think it could be the industry? And for many countries in the world, this is still an enormously new idea to them. And I was in one country in the Middle East, and they said, well, I don't think the tobacco industry is doing very much here. So I Googled away, they're supporting the Queen's Fund. Now, how nice is that? The Queen's Fund. So, there is your answer. It's not difficult to find out, really, some of the things that this industry is doing. So I think if you want to take on these communicable diseases, if you treat it just as individual behaviour, you will absolutely get nowhere. I was interviewed on RTHK last week, and the interviewer said, well, the non-communicable diseases, these are just lifestyle diseases, aren't they? And then she said to me, well, obviously the solution for this is education, isn't it? As if that was it. And I said, absolutely not. I mean, these non-communicable diseases, there's a responsibility, yes, of the individual to look after their own health. But then you've got the responsibility of government to set the templates by legislation, by taxation, by cycle tracks, by banning advertising on television, by all of these things. Government have that responsibility to set the template for these things to happen and for individuals to be able to make these choices. And then, in fact, you've got business and industry who have a responsibility with their products with providing a safe working environment. Taking asbestos out of production lines, so to speak, making sure that there's not sexual abuse in the workplace. Everybody, actually you've almost come to the conclusion that it's the whole of civil society has got a responsibility. That if you are going to try and tackle non-communicable diseases, you have to look at this political dimension, and you have to become amateur health economists. Because the reality is that what governments listen to is not the health argument anymore. That's almost assumed. Nobody now, in any government I've come across in the last 10 years, says, well, I don't really think cigarettes are that harmful. It's not on that basis anymore. It's on the basis very much of economics. And the feeling is that if the government takes action against tobacco, that somehow it will be economically damaging. When we banned smoking here in 2007 in restaurants and bars, and we had the whole restaurant and bar industry sort of fighting against this, it was very much phased, and I have to say that, you know, some of the tobacco industry supporters, like KPMG, were threatening that Hong Kong would lose restaurants, the restaurants would lose revenue, they would go out of business. It didn't happen. When we banned, just to give you one example, when we banned smoking in restaurants and bars, we looked at the tax income the month before the ban, and we looked at it 2 years later, and it had gone up 31%. The restaurants did enormously well. And I think, you know, we've got to get hold of this economic argument, because the reality is that tobacco control and NCD control is good for wealth. It's not just health, it's not economics or tobacco or health. It's not economics or health at all. It's economics and health. It makes very good economic sense to actually have all these preventive programs in place.
Like that, economics and health.